So good evening and welcome. My name is Al Buchkowski and I'm the chairperson of a little group called We Vote CBC Peterborough. We are a small group of people who are passionate about our public broadcaster and fact-based journalism, which both play an essential role in our democracy. What better place to hold an event like this than the Canadian Canoe Museum? Time magazine did a survey of the 100 places to visit in the world, and we are on that list. So tonight's discussions, I'm really looking forward to it. I know all of us have had a lot of anxiety in these last few months. I find me and my friends always saying, don't we live in interesting times? Tonight we have some wonderful speakers to talk about how Canada can survive the trade war and about the importance of fact-based journalism and our public broadcaster, the CBC. And after we hear from our speakers, we will turn to our candidates, and they will get to comment on what they've heard and talk about the policies that their parties are offering. So I hope you enjoy this evening, and I'll turn it over to Dennis to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. I'm Dennis Howlett, resident for about 7 years now almost in Peterborough. And I've been asked to moderate this session. I'd like to introduce our speakers. The first person to speak is Jennifer Ciccone, is that right? She's the Senior Director of Fund Development and Campaign Strategy for Friends of Canadian Media.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to put this down. Starting a little nervous. I just got the word to do this speech a couple days ago. Our executive director's fallen ill on the campaign trail. So I'm here to present a small talk on CBC and why it's important. So Friends of Canadian Media has been around since 1985 when the fight to defend the CBC began. And you might actually here in Peterborough remember in 2015, we had signs all over for the I Vote CBC campaign. In fact, in Elections Canada confirmed that we were the most active nonprofit in Canada during that election. And in that election, the Liberals won, and the Liberals listened to what we said, and they funded the CBC. The power of the people. But now, 10 years later, we're in a different situation. It's 2025. Luke eventually will be up here talking about the importance of independent Canadian media for an independent country. And it's true, independent media is essential for our sovereignty. And at the heart of that independent media is the CBC, Radio-Canada. It's our cultural animal, pardon the American reference. By every way you can measure audience success, the CBC delivers value for our money. It's 10 cents per person, per day, per year. That's it. That's all it costs. And with that value, CBC is the #1 national news network. #1. It's the biggest producer of Canadian comedies and drama. #1. It's tops in radio audience. It's tops in online news. However, there's one rating that gets talked about all the time. And so let me talk about that. The glaring exception in the ratings game is CBC English Television's 5% share of the TV audience. Now, we're talking about broadcast TV. So, for the youngins in the room, that's linear TV. That's the box. That's not online streaming on online platforms. So it's just that. That's 1 in 20 viewers at any given time. That 5% is down from 10% about a decade ago. But this is not a CBC phenomenon. This is a television phenomenon. CTV's ratings have also declined from 14% to 10%, and global is down to 9%. And the reason they are still ahead of the all-Canadian CBC, they broadcast high-budget American dramas and viral reality TV. CBC doesn't. The CBC also takes chances that others won't. It made 3 seasons of the surprise hit, sort of. And we all know Schitt's Creek. When every other network said no in Canada and the US, CBC said yes. And then we saw in 2020, it swept the Emmys. It's a Canadian phenomenon, and it's a phenomenal show. But here's the good news. We can change that 5%, but only if we're willing to fund the CBC with enough money to compete with the multi-million-dollar American budgets, like Netflix, and Amazon, and Disney. The CBC doesn't need to match the US dollar for dollar. Even without the big money, the CBC regularly produces hit shows like Murdoch Mysteries, Kim's Convenience, because they're such great Canadian stories by such great Canadian talent. They also resonate worldwide. Heartland is in its 18th season, and it is watched worldwide. It has fans from Austria, Australia, the United States. They travel all over just to get to Alberta to go see the farm. And to illustrate my point a little further, maybe you've been watching CBC's new show, North of North. It's a comedy series. Yes. Oh, we've got some there. It's a comedy series set in a Nunavut town, filmed on location in Iqaluit. It's a hit. It's authentic, and it's as Canadian as a butter tart or a bunny hug in Saskatchewan. But the episode budgets were very high because it had to be shot in the far north. The only way the CBC could afford this was by taking on Netflix as an investor. And they had to hand over the global distribution rights in return. This is the reality that CBC has faced after decades of cuts and underfunding. How to tell great Canadian stories on a shoestring budget. The answer has always been more funding, and to make it even harder, the CBC has been bleeding its television budget to pay for its online expansion. Inadequate funding makes for some ruthless decisions and underwhelming television ratings. But guess what? The CBC haters don't care. None of this makes an impression on the CBC defunders in the Conservative Party or in right-wing social media. You won't catch them talking about the importance of Canadian culture one way or another. It's about news. What the defunders want is to force CBC News off the air, the better to fill the information void with right-wing voices. It's the same sort of thing that the Republican Friends are doing to the south of the border, where NPR and PBS are now being labeled as radical left-wing media. In fact, they just introduced a defunding bill in Congress, and Donald Trump thinks it's wonderful. On this side of the border, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre thinks it's great too. He keeps telling us that the CBC is woke, and we don't need it anymore, that the television isn't good enough. I think a lot of Emmys would tell them otherwise. But what do you think? Without a CBC, can we rally Canadians together over the next 4 years to keep this country out of the clutches of Donald Trump? Or keep us from being forced to join Greenland and bow to Trump as a vassal state? Can we defend an independent Canada by laying off a third of this country's journalists while misinformation floods the universe? Should we defund the CBC when the National Post and the biggest print media chain in Canada are owned and controlled by a New Jersey hedge fund which supports Donald Trump? By the way, it also owns the National Enquirer. Can we defend an independent Canada by relying solely on a privately owned Canadian media that is on its back heels, its advertising revenue poached by Google and Facebook, and routinely laying off television staff and closing or selling radio stations at an alarming rate? And local news is disappearing. Over 500 outlets since 2008 have disappeared in over 300 communities. Should we, at this critical point in our history, just rip out the heart of Canadian media, the CBC? As my boss would say, somebody please make sense of this. The CBC haters have been at it for so long now, they've created urban myths. The CBC is biased. The CBC is not trusted. The CBC is the Liberals' propaganda machine. Really? According to private pollsters, the CBC is the most trusted news organization in Canada, ahead of CTV, Global, Post Media, The Globe, The Star, The National Post. The CBC is the biggest producer of Canadian stories on television, far more than any other private network. The CBC is the top radio network in the country. It's the voice of Canada that has transfixed us during the most consequential events of our lifetimes. And it's there for us in emergencies. Hurricane Fiona, the Fort McMurray fires. And 79% of Canadians believe that the CBC is as important than ever now. For so many of us, the CBC is where our Canadian souls bask in the warmth of our local community, like here in Peterborough. It's amazing how many of you have shown up today. We bask in the warmth of our, not just our communities, but our province and our country. It's all one piece, both news and culture, on CBC, because what we call our cultural sovereignty is how we identify as Canadians, not North Americans. It's our culture, everything from televised news to the performing arts, from books to social media posts, from Saturday morning at the rink to Sunday morning at Tim's with your double-double. It's all of that culture that creates the conditions and opportunities for politics and Canadian sovereignty. If we are North American, then we're really Americans. If we are Canadians, we must live in Canadian culture. The CBC is the biggest and most widely shared community for that. For 90 years, it's been around. And it was started by a conservative to strengthen Canadian culture and sovereignty as American media encroached past our borders. There's a degree of irony in that right now. This is an exciting time to support the CBC and to be a Canadian. We can make it better, more trusted, and welcomed in our lives. There are a lot of great ideas thrown out there in the last few months on how to make the CBC even better. And I do say even better. We might have to accept the idea that there are as many opinions on the perfect CBC as there are Canadians. And we saw it firsthand last year when we launched our Have Your Say campaign. We heard from Canadians from every province and every territory. And it was amazing. The difference in opinions, all great ideas, and also heard from those that didn't like the CBC. And we noticed that there was a difference. Those that were critical for reasons. Those that just wanted to define it didn't have a reason. And it was really great to be able to pass that off to the government and hope that it's going to continue to move change on what the CBC is for us as Canadians. And we have to be prepared to back the CBC with funding it takes to make it more like the perfect CBC. The CBC has lost 36% of funding since Brian Mulroney started cutting its funding 40 years ago when we made our start. As Friends of, back then it was Friends of Public Broadcasting was our first name. And that doesn't account for inflation, for the record. And it's a difficult time to find budget dollars right now. We know that. But this is a national emergency, and it's not the time to stint on our communication networks. We need to send a message to politicians that they must commit in this election campaign to the CBC's long-term prosperity, just as they commit to our independence and our sovereignty. Because now more than ever, it's time to stand up for our voice. It's time to stand up for the CBC. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.